Order. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. This House censures the Prime Minister for his statement that al-Qaeda is praying for a Democratic Party candidate to win the next United States presidential election. 2. His false statement today in Parliament that his statement yesterday was restricted to one US senator and not to the Democratic Party as a whole. 3. The damage that this partisan comment has done to the United States-Australia alliance and to Australia's relationships with both American Democratic and Republican members of the Congress. And 4. The gross insensitivity of lecturing the United States presidential candidates on Iraq when the war in Iraq is responsible for the deaths of more than 3,000 US servicemen and women, the wounding of another 20,000 and expenditures exceeding $360 billion, and finally demands that the Prime Minister unreservedly withdraws this remark.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How can the man who is Prime Minister of this country come into this Parliament and say that he is a person of experience on the question of national security when, within the last 24 hours, he has made this statement, that when it comes to the operation of al-Qaeda and its dealings in the world of international affairs today, that somehow al-Qaeda is a terrorist organisation that would prefer to see a Democrat win the next presidential elections rather than any other representative of another political party. The Prime Minister today has inserted that, in fact, he was only making a reference to Mr Obama, one of the US Democratic Party presidential candidates. It's important that we place this unequivocally on the record. Yesterday, the Prime Minister was asked this question in relation to the Obama plan. Yes, I think he's wrong. I mean, he's a long way from being President of the United States. I think he's wrong. I think that would just encourage those who wanted completely to destabilise and destroy Iraq and create chaos and victory for the terrorists to hang on and to hope for Obama victory. If I was running al-Qaeda in Iraq, I would put a circle around March 2008 and pray as many times as possible for a victory, not only for Obama, but also for the Democrats. That is not an addition invented by the Australian Labor Party. That's not an addition invented by anybody else. That was spoken yesterday, or would we dare say misspoken yesterday, by the Prime Minister of Australia on a matter of great consequence. That is the future of this country's relationship with the United States, particularly on the question of the future direction of Iraq policy. To accuse the Democratic Party of the United States as being al-Qaeda's party of choice, to accuse the Democratic Party as being the terrorists' party of choice, this is a most serious charge. To accuse the party of Roosevelt, to accuse the party of Truman, to accuse the party of Kennedy and Johnson of being the terrorist party of choice. I cannot understand how any responsible leader of this country can say to the nation that it is his serious view that the Democratic Party of the United States is the terrorist party of choice. But these are your words, Prime Minister. I did not invent them. They are yours. And in this Parliament today, we gave you every opportunity to say that you got it wrong.
The Leader will refer his marks through the Chair. We gave the Prime Minister every opportunity to say that it was wrong.
That's right. It may have been that he got caught up in the flurry of the interview. It may have been that he didn't hear it clearly. It may have been that he didn't understand it clearly. I understand that these things can happen. But when you are given not once but twice but on 3 separate occasions in this place today an opportunity to say, I got that wrong, I didn't mean that, and for him to pass each one of those up, I think says much about the partisan nature with which this Prime Minister now views the relationship with our great American ally. Let us be absolutely clear about what is at stake here. Not just an attack on a single US senator, but an attack upon an entire political party. And here is where Australia's national interest kicks in. This party, the Democratic Party, currently controls the majority in the United States House. It controls the majority in the United States Senate, and within a year or so's time may control the White House itself. And this is the party which this Prime Minister in this country and this Parliament today has reaffirmed he describes as the terrorist party of choice. This is a serious matter. Prime Minister, could you imagine if I stood up in this Parliament as the alternative Prime Minister and said to the people of Australia that the terrorists would be advantaged if the Republicans were to return to the White House at the next presidential election? Ponder for a moment how that would be regarded. How would it be seized on by those opposites? If I stood at this dispatch box, if I appeared on national television and said that the Republicans, if they won, would cause an eruption of joy on the part of al-Qaeda and the part of the terrorists, can you imagine the reaction from those opposites? This is a grave mistake, and I fear that it reflects a deep view on the part of the Prime Minister in terms of those he may not share a view within the US political system. Prime Minister, you have said much in recent times about your experience for this job. Would an experienced Prime Minister have said something like this?
No.
Would an experienced Prime Minister have said something as irresponsible as this? Would an experienced Prime Minister have said something as reckless as this? I would say, Prime Minister, that these sorts of remarks reflect that on these questions you are prepared to allow partisan considerations to enter into the debate about this country's long-term national security interests. It goes to the core question of what an experienced person should and should not do if you are charged with the high office of being the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia. And this at a time, this is not an idle debating point, this is now a matter for active debate right around the world. On CNN and the US domestic body politic, you've got Democratic congressmen and Republican congressmen making public remarks and reacting against this Prime Minister's statement. It is not a mild, indirect, academic debating point of whether this is of consequence. To stand in this Parliament and say that the alternative presidential party of the United States of America is somehow within the thrall of terrorists. That's where this ultimate argument goes. Prime Minister, this, like your remarks last week, was a grave error of judgment. This was a grave error of prime ministerial judgment. A grave error of prime ministerial judgment when we expect something more of our Prime Minister. But let us go also to the question of truth. In this Parliament we've become used to a Prime Minister who, when he says that black is white and white is black, that I didn't say that, but in fact I said this, that somehow by virtue of his declaration it's all better. And on 2 occasions today in the Parliament he said, I did not say that he intended any generic critique of the Democratic Party. He said on 2 occasions he was referring only to an individual. He then said it was only a reference to Senator Obama and not a generic reference to the Democratic Party. There is no way you can read this more clearly than it is rendered here at present. He says, I would put a circle around March 2008 and pray as many times as possible for a victory not only for Obama but also for the Democrats. Prime Minister, you are found out in this debate for not telling the truth. And I would say, Prime Minister, given the nature of this censure, as it goes to not just the content of your competence in dealing with the United States on these matters and the prospective alternative administration of the United States, it also goes to a core question of truth.
That's right.
Because you cannot simply stand there and perhaps, Prime Minister, after a decade or more in office, the Prime Minister has become used to this, to stand at a dispatch box and declare that X is Y and Y is X, when we all know it is not the case, that it is not the truth. You are caught out, Prime Minister, by the text of what you said yesterday. However, you and the spin doctors may choose to represent it or misrepresent it in the general political debate of this country.
What would be the consequence?
When it comes to...
Order!
When it comes to...
The member for Flinders is warned.
So my charge around the censure motion, Mr Speaker, is along these lines. It has been not an act of experience, not an act of competent foreign policy, but in fact a reckless act to make such an extraordinary statement about the alternative administration of the United States. Secondly, my charge is that this Prime Minister has misled the Parliament today by what he has said in trying to pretend that his statement yesterday had nothing to do with a generic attack on the United States Democratic